far. We had a opening great keynote from Reverend William Barber, really talking about those issues around people power and policy. If you remember, he talked about poverty, how we need to focus on people who are poor. And you can look at race and class together, but these are moral issues. And we got to be focused on increasing the minimum wage, making sure people have access to opportunity. Reasons why many folks are differentially impacted by some of these exposures. He talked about ecological devastation because they don't have enough access to infrastructure, right? And he also talked about how do we bridge, right? How do we build together? How do we grow power? How do we look at our shared humanity? And so very, very important to set us up for this particular session. And also we had a first block of concurrent sessions. Hope you enjoyed those sessions. Today, as part of this lunchtime plenary, we have basically a conversation / interview with Mustafa Santiago Ali. And this session is about reparations. I know many of you have heard about the discussions of reparations for Blacks in this country, those of descendants of enslaved Africans, also for indigenous brothers and sisters. And also, we think about reparations globally. When you think about the loss of land for other tribal indigenous peoples around the world, and also as it relates to climate change. So today, again, we have with us, again, this is going to be more interview conversation, Mustafa Santiago Ali. He's a renowned thought leader, international speaker, policymaker, community liaison, trainer, and facilitator. He serves as the executive vice president for the National Wildlife Federation. He is also founder of Revitalization Strategies, a business focused on moving our most vulnerable communities from this Mustafaism, surviving to thriving. Before joining the National Wildlife Federation, he was the senior vice president for the Hip Hop Caucus. As you know, Reverend Yearwood is going to be one of our keynote speakers speaking on Saturday, September 16th, a national nonprofit and nonpartisan organization that connects the hip hop community to the civic process to build power and create positive change. In his role with the Hip Hop Caucus, he led strategic direction, expansion, and operation of its portfolio on climate, environmental justice, and community revitalization. Before going to the Hip Hop Caucus, Mustafa worked for 24 years at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. He began working on these social justice issues at the age of 16 and joined the EPA as a student. I've actually known Mustafa since 1994, something like that. And he was a founding member of the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice. He most recently served, before he left EPA, as Senior Advisor for Environmental Justice, Community Revitalization, and Assistant Associate Administrator, working to elevate environmental justice issues and strengthening environmental justice policies. Mustafa has done y'all see Mustafa on TV and radio a lot. He has a very long bio. So I just want to make sure that, happy to have you here today, Mustafa. I want to jump in this discussion about reparations, restorative justice, if not now, then when? And the first question you, Brother Mustafa, is, what do you think, just before we jump into that part, what do you think is happening, what should be happening right now in this country as it relates to the larger issue of environmental justice first? I mean, where are we at when it comes to the environmental justice movement?
Well, we made some progress, most definitely. If you remember in the early years, we didn't have programs in colleges and universities around environmental justice. We didn't have statutes in place, whether on the local, the county, the state, or the federal level. We didn't have resources that were dedicated to addressing the impacts that are happening inside of our communities in any significant fashion. And we've been able to change that dynamic because of all the amazing frontline leaders who have been putting pressure on entities to do better, to make sure that folks see us as human, and not only seeing us as human, but understanding that our lives have value, and that we will no longer allow ourselves to be mistreated, to be marginalized. And today, things have changed, but we still have an incredibly long way to go, because as with almost every social justice or civil rights movement that has garnered traction, you have those who then come out and try to move things backwards, to reverse the progress that has happened. And you see that happening now on Capitol Hill. You see companies and some foundations and others who are beginning to not support DEI and other important issues at the level that they once did, especially after our dear brother George Floyd died. You saw everybody rush into that space, make commitments, and then began to, move back away from those. This is a moment for everyone to really double down and to make sure that we are building strong coalitions and that we are holding elected officials accountable, that we are holding corporations accountable, and that we are holding organizations who say that they are allies accountable as well.
No, thank you for that. I think those are really important points because everybody want to jump onto the bandwagon and trying to be, I'm not saying being woke or being progressive, but when you talk about addressing these issues of environmental justice, address these issues of social injustice, of racial injustice, these are real issues, everybody. These are not play issues. This work is not for the faint of heart. And I think the theme of this symposium is people, power, and politics. I think the politics have scared some of those organizations that you mentioned. I just don't want to say that. I'm gonna keep moving though, Mustafa. So can you tell the audience, the attendees, what are some of the big, you talked about this is an important moment. What are some of these big EJ, moments that have happened over the last 10, 15 years? They just want to highlight as it relates to what's happened to our indigenous brothers and sisters, for example. What's happening to our brothers and sisters in the global south? What should we be talking about as we bring more people into this movement? And just to highlight EJ concerns for those two groups, indigenous brothers and sisters, and also brothers and sisters around the global south.
Well, we should be talking about life because the impacts that are happening in our country to Black and Brown and indigenous folks and lower wealth communities are the same types of things that are happening across the globe. And, Sokobi, folks often want to get away from talking about environmental injustice or environmental racism and jump straight to talking about climate change, as you can't, because the two are interchangeable. And because of the drivers that have been happening inside of our communities, the air pollution, the various sets of toxins, they are now playing a role in exacerbating what we're seeing with the climate crisis. So the issues that I would have people focus on, one is always talk about life, right? Talk about the 7 to 8 million people who are dying disproportionately and prematurely from air pollution across the globe. And they're dying because we can't break our addiction to fossil fuels, or we have not yet broken our addiction from fossil fuels and began to move forward in a just transition. And of course, that is also a major driver. It's one of the major drivers in the climate crisis, the air pollution that continues to be up there. I would say that the pipeline fights are also incredibly important because, again, it goes back to the fossil fuels. In our country, we have about 2.4 million miles of fossil fuel pipeline, enough to go to the moon and back a few times. And when you look across the planet and all the fossil fuel pipeline that we have, it's almost unimaginable. What it's carrying is really causing many of these deaths and diseases, and we've got to get our arms around it. And of course, in the global south, those brothers and sisters and family are the ones who are carrying the disproportionate burden and who have not, contributed to the carbon footprint in any significant way, the way that other more developed countries have, and yet they continue to pimp these countries in our international negotiations. They continue to disinvest and break promises about the resources that have been identified that help folks to be able to move forward. And then the other issue that we have to talk about is water. Indigenous brothers and sisters and all of the folks who we've been raised by have always told us that water is life. And as we look across the global south, as we look here in our country and in other locations where indigenous brothers and sisters are, and Black and Brown folks, that we know that water is tainted water is one of the also major drivers of loss of life. So we have to pay attention to those things, but we also have to pay attention to the political processes that are playing out across our planet. Here in our country, we see that there is a conservative movement to roll back basic, let me say it again for folks, basic environmental protections. And when you look at it across the globe, you're also starting to see these very similar types of playbooks being used, whether it is in South America or Africa, in the islands, or a number of other locations. So I think that we just have to be very, very focused on life, What are the drivers that are shortening life? What are the drivers that are driving up healthcare costs? And then the other part of it is making sure that we are redirecting resources to the spaces and places that need them the most.
Thank you for that, sir. So you kind of hit on it a little bit. Think about these issues, and for the attendees, I'm gonna share a term that you may have not heard before, and it's going to connect back to this discussion about reparations, restorative justice. But Mustafa talked about environmental racism, and I like to introduce to many of you the term environmental slavery, or environmental oppression. Reverend Barber, I think he talked about. I think he may have mentioned environmental oppression a little bit in his keynote address. But you think about how some communities are basically used to host these extractive industries, used to host these hazards that Mustafa talked about, how people are basically being commodified and decommodified. So you think about environmental slavery is the extension of slavery, right? You can't talk about, I think sometimes Mustafa, we talk about environmental racism, it doesn't give the full context, the historical context, right, of what folks are experiencing. We have examples of folks experiencing environmental slavery in this country today, who are descendants of enslaved peoples, who are descendants of peoples whose lands have been stolen from them. Because you think about the extractive industries that are on the lands, the lands of indigenous brothers and sisters, the reservations, and what they're going through. So, can you speak to the issue of extractive capitalism and supremacy and perpetuating these issues that you just outlined?
Well, we see it, in so many different locations across our country. Whether you want to go to Appalachia and see how the coal industry for, decades upon decades utilize different folks moving into that space to work and then putting them against each other and then locking and trapping them in to servitude because they used to own the doctor, they owned the company store, they owned all the various things. So folks, their hands were really tied in being able to move forward in any type of a positive way. If you look at the fights that are going on right now around protecting our forest and the dynamics that are playing out where, people once again are being marginalized, they're being trapped because of these huge corporations, whether they're doing the wood pellet stuff or a number of other things. And you see that dynamic not only in this country, but across the country. People are literally, trapped. If you go and you take a look at some of the dynamics that are playing out in Florida and other locations around sugarcane and some of the things that are there, you see this history of people who were denied education. You see a history of people who are denied healthcare, and you see industries that literally have locked people in and won't let other businesses come into the area. And same dynamic in Appalachia. So when you talk about servitude, you got to understand these processes that are put in place that make it very difficult for someone to break free of that. And then people will say, well, people can just move away. So let's unpack that very quickly also, because a part of these dynamics is also when you have these types of industries in an area, then they devalue people's homes. In many instances, people's homes will lose value or they never can grow in value. So therefore, the question becomes, if my home is not worth very much, where do I go? I end up having to go to another community if I can break free that is facing similar dynamics because of it's cost prohibitive for you to be able to do it. So we really got to just unpack all these dynamics that are underneath of servitude to ask the question, how is it that people get locked in? And then why aren't we putting processes in place to help people break free?
And think about that again, audience. This issue of home ownership, it's been touted as the number one way to build wealth, right? One of the important ways to build wealth in this country. If you're in a community where you're being dumped on, you're in a sacrifice zone. Mustafa just said it. Your home, you lose value. You may be underwater as relates to your loans, et cetera, right? So how are you supposed to pass that down to the next generation when basically the contamination, right, the toxic trauma, the pollution that you're experiencing basically steals it away, right? You lose that. So I'm trying to get us down this road, Mustafa, get into this issue of reparations, restorative justice, because how can we restore that, right? So how can we bring people back when their homes, their land have been devalued? They've been devalued, right? Their homes, their land, people who own land around these toxic facilities, the land has been devalued. So can you elaborate on, just for our audience, we talk about environmental justice, the differential burden of hazards, the movements, where we live, where we work, we play, we pray, we learn, right? EPA has its definition, right? Bunyan Brown has a definition. I'm not saying this stuff fast, y'all. Dr. Bullitt has his definition, right? But when you think about the principles of environmental justice, we talk about representative justice, right? We talk about distributed justice, procedural justice. Can you talk about restorative justice? What does that mean? Share that with the audience.
Well, restorative justice really means about addressing the past harms. There are 5 parts to sort of what I call reparations and restorative justice, around cessation, around non-repetition, around restitution, around compensation, satisfaction, and rehabilitation. You have all these different dynamics that are sort of the cornerstones, if you will, of being able to restore, to make sure that people are taking responsibility for the things that they've done in the past, which is really difficult. It seems like it's a difficult thing, especially for folks in this country, to understand that if you break something, if you damage something, then you have a responsibility to repair it. Now, it's interesting that when it comes to other countries, we expect them to do that. If you look at the history around reparations, you can go back to 1560. It's the first time that people start using the Latin word is there, and people began to think about how do we make sure that we are restoring something that has been damaged, if you will. When we look at restorative justice, we also have to call out the fact that the United States government doesn't have a problem in telling Germany or Japan that they had a responsibility because of World War I and World War II, to make sure that there were both resources and sets of actions to fix what was broken during the war, right? You've got all these different dynamics that are going on for those people who are Christians in the theoretical sense. There are language that's inside of our religious books that talk about having to repair. And it is a part of that whole theology, if you will. And we were blessed to have Reverend Barber, who were there with us earlier. So restorative justice is really about beginning to look at those sets of policies, both on the financial side and the impact side, that have to be addressed. You can unpack it in a lot of ways, Dr. Wilson. We can look at, once again, what has happened with farmers, as an example. Let's start off with land, right? So we know that in relationship to land, our indigenous brothers and sisters, this was their country, right? And that literally, if you look at the amount of acreage that we have in this country, and you begin to place even a minimal monetary value on it, we are talking about trillions of dollars that is due to our indigenous brothers and sisters. If we look at Black farmers, since that's been was in the news there for a while, and we thought we finally got some traction to be able to address the egregious actions that have been happening to them. And then we had those individuals who wanted to bring court cases forward. The estimation around just Black farmland that has disappeared and been stolen in many instances is over $360 billion. So there are ways for us to begin to think critically about how do we repair? How do we make sure that there is restitution to the individuals who have been harmed? If we look at in the housing context, and for everybody who's watching, this is about policy, right? Prejudice and racism, can be built into policy, but we can also undo it, and we can also make sure that policy is used for the good and not the bad, because there was policy that was put in place to segregate folks. I know most folks on the line who are watching today know about redlining and restrictive covenants and how they were used to actually push people into certain areas. So when Dr. Wilson was also just building upon what I had shared, it's not just what the land is like now. We know because where people have been pushed into sacrifice zones, into the least desirable locations, that land now will continue to go down because of floods and because of hurricanes and a number of other dynamics. But we also know that there was intentionality about making sure that Black folks could not own land, or they could not own land in the most desirable location. So once again, it is all about policy. It's about the policy also around transportation and how our roads were used to break up thriving communities, if you will, to take resources into other communities and to drop off pollution into ours. All of this has to be a part of reparations, of how we take a look at the missteps that were done in the past and how now in this moment that we demand it. The question becomes, how do we do that? We do that by making sure that, if we're going to talk about through an environmental justice lens, that in all of the programs and policies that from this moment forward have the criteria of environmental justice inside of it, has economic justice built into it. And when we begin to think about that, whether it's through housing, healthcare, economic employment, the environment, so forth and so on, then we can begin to, pull back all of the things that have happened that have put us in these dire situations. So reparations has to be through restoration in the form of making sure that our voices are actually helping to drive the process.
Thank you, Mustafa. I want to just add again. This is an interview / conversation, so I'm gonna add a couple of my pennies in this conversation. So Mustafa just talked about this issue of transportation, right? So those of you know who don't know, thinking about the National Highway Defense Act, as he stated, highways and byways were built on purpose through folks' communities, through Black and Brown communities, through other communities, right? And think about the destruction, that using the term devastation that Reverend Barber mentioned, and that fragmentation, and so the loss of property value, right? The loss of connectivity. And then Mustafa talked about pollution. We're basically, when we drive our cars, if you're driving a gas guzzler or something that's burning fossil fuels and combustion byproducts have been left, you're leaving poison in people's communities, right? We have to be aware of that footprint. You use this kind of euphemistic term, carbon footprint. You have a poison footprint that we leave in people's communities when we drive our cars. We make the decision to drive a gas guzzler. Now, maybe it may be your only choice, or you ride a bus that's burning diesel. It may be your only choice, but that's the reality. So, how, as he said, how do we address that long-term cyclical, impact across intergenerational impacts? Another part of environmental justice is intergenerational justice, right? And when Mustafa talked about the housing issues, okay. So when we talk about reparations, there are multiple components. We have to have a holistic approach when thinking about reparation and restoring communities, restoring them, making them whole. How do we make communities whole that have been used again to host these hazards or host these land uses? All right. And then real quick, I'll pass the mic back to this next question, Mustafa. Even when you think about, Mustafa mentioned power and privilege. I have to say the isms are the policies are embedded in our policies, right? Zoning. Like a lot of problems, you think about some of our urban areas, zoning has been weaponized. So we need to look at zoning too, and how some communities have been zoned for pollution, zoned for poisons, right? Zoned to be sacrificed. I just want to share that, Mustafa. Yeah. So just kind of keep moving. And you talked about, the Black farmers. On Thursday night, we're gonna have a documentary called Smell of Money. It's about industrial hog farming in North Carolina, and Elsie Herring is highlighted in the documentary. So for those who are going to attend in person, please show up, because it brings that example Mustafa just mentioned of Black farmers. Her farmland that she received from her grandparents, I believe, received some farmland. It was stolen from them and then used for hog farming. So think about your land that you received got stolen from you due to white supremacy, right? And then you get surrounded by industrial hog farms. That's another example. These are examples of people experiencing time and time again in various parts of the country. So Mustafa, this next question is, we have this land back movement, right, in the U.S. And globally, and we have the Black Lives Matter movement. How do you think those movements can help us, drive the reparations agenda in this country, and also drive the agenda when it comes to reparations of also land sovereignty, right? So I think it's an important part of this. And when we talk about empowerment, everybody, I think, as Mustafa said, land is a part of it. So again, Black Lives Matter, land back movements in power and sovereignty, sir?
Well, it's incredibly important. I mean, the one thing that they're not doing, or let me say they're not doing in any significant way, is creating more land, right? We see some countries who have done some fill in and that type of thing and built some things. But in general, I mean, land has always been about power, right? Land has been about freedom, if you will. So for the organizations who are focusing on it, I think they are most definitely pointed in the right direction. The question becomes, how do we educate folks, one, on the history of how land has been stolen in some instances, has been divvied up, and the dynamics of how that has played out in finding many communities in the situation that they find themselves in. In relationship to the United States of America, many people heard about 40 acres and a mule, right? Not really understanding the fullness of what went on in that space. And there was some positive intentions. It was never about a mule. It was about those 40 acres. So, and those would have been incredibly important for freed enslaved people to be able to actually get a strong foundation underneath of them. And then, of course, you had President Lincoln, who was assassinated. The next person who came in, who was pro-slavery, began to pull that back and not honor what General Sherman had tried to move forward. But the importance of that is that if individuals had been able to garner those 40 acres at that time, it would have been able to change power dynamics, right? Because land was also tied to being able to vote in some places, along with a number of other dynamics, of course, that were part of the voting process and also limiting people. If you fast forward today, people would have, significant more amounts of wealth if that had been honored. So now we have this moment, right, where we have an administration currently that has made some positive moves. We have to make sure on the international set of conversations that we're also partnering with all these organizations to make sure that people, no matter if they're in our country or in other countries, are being honored in relationship to being able to own land, being able to build into international agreements, into whatever laws that might exist, that this has to be the case. If we don't do that, we see some of the dynamics that are continue to play out. We're going to have, corporations who will continue to cite and will continue to pollute because they will be able to purchase the land and be able to manipulate the process. In our country, we also see the dynamic that we have to return land, one, to indigenous brothers and sisters where it was, illegally garnered from them, to Black folks and brown folks. And we can do this, but once again, it requires us making sure that we have strong coalitions. That's why I appreciated so much Reverend Barber, being kicking off everything, because when he talked about, not only the vision that Dr. King had, but also what the Repairs of the Breach and others are doing now about bringing folks together, Black and brown and lower wealth communities, to say that for no more will you manipulate the situation, and we will make sure that we are garnering the things that we deserve and that should be a part of this whole American dream that they often talk about, which many of us have not seen as a dream. Some have seen it as a nightmare. Others have seen it as something quite lacking.
Thank you for that powerful statement, Mustafa. Man, I think when we think about what's happening with the land back movement, again, everyone, when we think about these issues of reparations, you have to be holistic. It's a multifaceted approach. And so for me, you talked about, you got a little bit into this new administration, this not new administration, this administration. So how do you feel, and as a plan or process with the executive orders, with the bipartisan infrastructure law and the monies, how do you think will that get us at least as a down payment on reparations for communities who've been impacted by environmental, climate, and energy injustices?
So let me do a couple of things here. I want to unpack a couple of things, and we'll move forward to this administration. So first, I want to give honor to a man that I used to work for, John Conyers, right? Because he used to have HR 40, which was known as the Reparations Act. And even though it was really about making sure that we got a study in place for, years upon years, he kept continuing to move forward on that. And I also want to bring our sister Cori Bush into our conversation because she has HR 414, which, once again, is focused on reparations. So we want to, you had asked that question before, what we should be doing. We should be getting behind and trying to, if there are enhancements that need to be made, making sure we're making those suggestions to those members who are actually trying to push this issue, because often we just kind of, blow with the wind. And I know that there are brothers and sisters who have been working on the reparations issues and who are experts in it. So one, we should be listening to them, and we should be working with those folks who are there, on Capitol Hill or in state houses to be supportive, because if we're not being supportive, even if it's not perfect, let's make sure that we are getting some of the things that we need, and then we can build upon those. Dr. Wilson, so then let's go to the current administration. So once again, if we, it is incredibly important, whether we're talking about the Inflation Reduction Act or, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, all these different things that are out there, the dollars that have been placed around climate and EJ, to once again bring into those conversations the need and the understanding of what has happened in the reparations space, to make sure that we're not leaving gaps in the process, if you will. We can do some things. So one, I always ask every audience that I ever stand in front of, how many folks have their own business? Because that's incredibly important, because with all these resources that are out there, there are contracting and subcontracting opportunities, and there's only a tiny percentage that goes to our communities. For me, that is a part of the reparations conversation, because we're looking at the overall pie, the overall pie, if you will, of resources that are out there, and we should be making sure that we are taking advantage of the opportunities that exist to build our own businesses, and we should be able to utilize, through contracting and subcontracting opportunities to do that. The other part of it is, when we're looking at the grants that are being created, thinking about the gaps that exist because of the lack of reparations is incredibly important, because what we're truly trying to do, or at least most of the folks that I've talked to, is one, empower our communities, and two, to build capacity inside of our communities. So we can do that as well to a degree by making sure that we're understanding these various resources that are going on. I know later on in the week, you're going to have a deep conversation about that. But when we're talking about whether it is healthcare, or whether we're talking about transportation or housing, or banking, or a number of other things, we should be working to make sure that the criteria is there and that we're holding people accountable, so that the resources are coming back in a holistic way, and not in a very siloed way.
No, thank you for that. So let's transition back to the global stage again. We had the recent COP discussions, and we talked about the damage and loss fund. Can you give the audience a little bit more sort of insight into that damage and loss fund process, where it is, where you think it should go, and then again, what you think we should be doing as attendees, participants in the movement here to support those international efforts?
Well, I'll give you my opinion, okay?
Okay.
In relationship to the damage and loss, it is an important concept. The words damage and loss is used instead of reparations, which tells you a little bit about where the mindset is, or where folks want to start from, and making sure both the Global South and a number of other locations are actually receiving the resources that are necessary, right? So in a theoretical concept, it makes sense. The question becomes people actually putting money with their words. And what you have is that people do a lot of hard work before the COP. There are sets of expectations that are in that space because people have invested their time, blood, sweat, and tears. And then when you get there, it becomes a very political process, if you will. And the rubber's not hitting the road in the way that people really need to see real sets of actions, real sets of dollars, because the climate crisis is continuing to move forward while we keep having political conversations about people's lives, about people's land. So we have a huge amount of work to do. I know through lots of conversations that some folks see value in going to COP28, others don't. What I would say is that, these sessions and opportunities before the larger COPs happen is where we have to really be focused, because that's where the words actually get put down, and the meaning behind them, and the actions to come. So I think we have to split our time in both sort of the drafting that happens beforehand and then pushing to hold people accountable, because we see what's currently going on in real time. We see the biblical floods that are happening in China, and across Europe right now, and a number of other locations. I don't want to, just limit them there. We saw what happened to brothers and sisters and family in Maui, and in Vermont, and the wildfires that are happening in other locations. So that's why this moment is so incredibly important. And that's why also having these structures in place around the damage that is going to happen, the loss that is going to happen, making sure that folks have the resource to deal with that side of the equation. But as importantly, having the resources to get in front of these types of climate emergencies is incredibly important also. And, people taking responsibility, the ones who have driven the climate crisis. We can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you for that. So one of the next questions I have for you, we see, at the metropolitan level in the country, we see cities they're getting behind reparations. You see the debate in California about reparations. I think the recent vote that folks were not supportive of the cash for descendants of enslaved Africans in California. So we have, I mean, so you have this kind of reparations relates to, slavery, right? And then I'm gonna call it environmental slavery and oppression and those connections. What do you see? Have you seen any progress? We know we talked about what Cory Bush is doing and others are doing in Congress, but have you seen any good steps forward in our country?
Well, I think that there is a conversation that's happening is a positive step. It is by no means the steps in totality that we need, but at least it being brought forward in city council meetings and county commission meetings and in some state houses is important. But here's the thing, Dr. Wilson. It is really about education. It is about us making sure that the misinformation around reparations, that there are entities that are paid to push, that you are balancing out that conversation. You are balancing out that information and getting to hopefully men and women of good conscience and family of good conscience, that they will begin to do the right thing. The other dynamic around that is that it's not only that we must vote, but we have to identify individuals who will stand up and will push to make sure that there's an agenda around reparations, and that they will not waver, right? So if we are not only talking about voting and how incredibly important that it is in this process, one, in helping to educate candidates who want our vote, two, making sure that they understand that there are experts who are out here who can help them to craft the legislation, and then three, that they will be held accountable is incredibly important. We often don't talk enough about the education that's necessary, and we just assume that people should get it, and we never realize that they may have also been fed some misinformation or some poison pills or however you want to label it around issues, and we know that that happens in the social justice context all the time. There are different steps that we can do. So you had asked the question, what do I think or what do I feel about the moment that we're in? I know that, when I was working for John Conyers and when we would talk about reparations, there were very few folks who had any idea around the utility of it or what does it encompass and why we wanted to make sure that this was being addressed. And now, there are a number of folks who are helping people to understand why this is something that needs to happen, should happen, and the value added of making sure that it happens.
Thank you for that. So I think we want to thank you again, Mustafa, for this interview slash conversation. I'm going to see if we have any questions from the audience uh, out there that can be put into my chat team.
Dr. Wilson,
As we
while you're
wait.
doing that,
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
yeah, I was just going to say, as you're waiting for folks to move into the chat, there's some other things that we can do also. We should be working with our cultural influencers to make sure that they have the information that's necessary and that they are partnering in an authentic way to help to get the message out. The vast majority of them, I have conversations, with some who just don't know a whole lot about it. So we got to help people to have the information that they need. We should be holding accountable, our organizations of color for not having this as one of their platform issues. If we're serious about this, then we have to hold those folks who love us and those who maybe don't know us accountable. And if we don't do that, we also have to begin to push corporations also for the responsibility that they have in this space. Some of them were around or at least had connections if we're looking at, chattel slavery in our country. But even after that, we know that the impacts and the ripple effects continue. So they have a responsibility also. Where are our foundations in relationship to reparations? Whether reparations in the larger context or environmental reparations, which our sister Tamara has always been bringing forward for a number of years now. So it's really about accountability, it's about education, and it is about us utilizing our power to be able to make sure that this becomes a reality. And then, of course, we also partner with on the international stage others, other frontline organizations who are also working in tandem to make it become a reality in their respective countries.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, you think about the issue of education. People may not know enough, and they, as you said, maybe fed misinformation. So they believe, oh, it's about a giveaway. It's you always say this giveaway language, or folks, or do people really deserve it? It happened so long ago. But you just said it, the ripples. That's again, everyone, intergenerational justice. What happened in the past impacts the present, and being aware of that and educating folks is important. I think you bring up a really good point about corporations and foundations. Foundations being in the space, and foundations who may have benefited from slavery, right? Corporations who may have benefited from slavery, right? Academic institutions. I'm not going to leave y'all out of this conversation. Who definitely, who you are, benefited from slavery, from descendants who built your buildings on your campus, right? Who you wouldn't have these beautiful campuses without that free labor. And then also we have to push back, as you said, the misinformation about the anti-CRT movement or the anti-truth movement. Because anybody who's talking about slavery, what was it recently that said slavery was like, what did they say in Florida in the textbook? I forget what they said. Some nonsense. But the folks out there who are basically trying to whitewash history. This is not the first time, everyone, the whitewashing of history. Why do you think we have a Black History Week that became a Black History Month, right? Why do you think we had that? Because of the whitewashing, the erasure of history. And when we don't talk about these issues around slavery, whether it be in the form of chattel slavery, environmental slavery, we are erasing history. And that's why this movement is important. So I just want to really tag on, add to what Mustafa just said. So when there's a question from the audience, back to this issue of innovation and Black apprenticeship gaps, how can we better hold departments, institutions accountable upstream when it comes to utilizing our community institutional knowledge?
Well, I think that there are a few different things that we can do there. If you want to look at some of the government programs that are out there, we got to once again make sure that they are representing what America looks like. And by what I mean by that is that they're building into the sets of opportunities that they are pushing forward understanding that our communities have not been able to fully participate in those sets of opportunities, and there has to be criteria. All those years that I worked, on the federal, work, one of the things that I notice is that if the language is not inside of the statutes or the regs or the grant program or the cooperative agreements, stating exactly what you're looking for, there's a strong chance that you are not going to be benefited by what's being pushed out. The other part of it is making sure that there's accountability on the backside, where there's someone who's taking a look, not at the end of a program, but consistently throughout, to say, what are the numbers looking like? Why aren't we reaching X? And what additional are we going to do to make sure that happens? Has to be a part of the process. The other part of it is in making sure that we are strengthening, because I believe that the person shared around Black apprenticeship. I can't see the screen that well.
Yeah,
but making sure that we are better supporting the organizations inside of our communities who focus in that space. Whether it is the engineers, right? The National Black engineers, or other organizations that are in that space. One, we should be making sure there are resources coming from the federal side of the equation to support them. Industry should also be making sure that they are having the resources that are necessary to make sure they're increasing the sets of opportunities around apprenticeships. And we should make sure that apprenticeships also have enough funding that they can run long enough and that they don't just stop, but that there's a relationship after. Let's say it's a 2-year apprenticeship. Well, then we have something that's post that keeps people connected and helps them to continue to be able to grow and to tap into those folks who have been doing it for a while. Whether you're talking about architects, you're talking about engineers, or it runs the gamut. Even on the education side, we know that we need to have more Black and brown teachers, right? So let's make sure that they have the relationships and the sets of opportunities around continual learning and mentoring that doesn't stop. And so that, one, they have the resources they need on the pay side, but on the other side, it's just that continual lifelong education that needs to play out. And you can just sort of supersede that in all these different categories that would help us. And once again, the question becomes, for foundations, what are you doing in this space to make sure that those sets of apprenticeship opportunities, especially since we are all so focused now on the clean economy, right? So to really build that out, it's not just about building solar and wind jobs. It is really about, one, the apprenticeships, but two, it is also about how are you helping to make sure that there are new sets of Black and brown and indigenous business owners in that space. And that means that there has to be mentoring and shadowing for folks who maybe are moving into this space for the first time. Less than 1% of all the businesses owned in the clean energy space are owned by folks of color, especially Black folks. So we have a set of opportunities that are in front of us. So I really appreciate that question around apprenticeship, because for me, apprenticeship is much broader than, a 6-month situation or a year situation. It is really about a much longer time frame.
And here's the last question. I don't see the complete question, Jessica. Thank you for I'll try to only get to see the first part. But it's about, speaking about the COP conference, there's been a long movement led by indigenous communities, especially from the global majority, to create their own tables. I don't know what the rest of the question is. It's not showing up. But can you talk about, I think, why that's important for indigenous people to have their own tables at COP? And that's part of the discussion that we'll have at our closing session, right? That'll be part of that discussion. But go ahead, Mustafa, if you want to chime in there. How do we balance? Okay, I got it. How do we balance the history with the critiques of the COP conference that we get from EJ leaders?
Well, thank you, Jessica, for the question, because we know that indigenous brothers and sisters across the planet are the ones who have lived in harmony, the ones who have had many of the solutions. Some of the solutions, of course, have been lost because of the impacts that have happened to indigenous communities. So it would only make sense to make sure that not only do they have the table, but they also have an incredibly strong voice in framing out the direction that we're going to go in. Indigenous environmental knowledge, since many of us work in the environmental space, is incredibly important in helping us to make sure that we have the right policies that are in place, to make sure that folks, once again, who have been unseen and unheard are a driver in the sets of actions and solutions that we're going to do. And it can't be pro forma, right? COP has some really positive things, but it also has a lot of pro forma stuff. And that is not where we need to be in this moment. It has to be about authenticity. It has to be about intentionality of making sure that when folks are coming together, that what they are sharing and creating is being implemented in the sets of solutions moving forward. So I really appreciate that question because we have got to make sure that we are real, that folks are honoring our voices and not just honoring them, but we are seeing it play out in substantive, accountable ways.
Well, thank you, Mustafa. It's always great to have these conversations with on very important issues. Hopefully, the audience, all the attendees, really took a lot from this discussion about the importance of reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans, for the indigenous brothers and sisters in the U.S., folks who lost their land globally, and also environmental reparations. Why we all need to be part of the discussion. And if you're doing EJ work, if you're not talking about reparations, Mustafa said, you're not talking about all the issues that are important to see, really get into justice, right? So reparations, restorative justice, reparative justice, intergenerational justice is a part of that. So thank you again, my brother. Appreciate you as always, holding it down. For all the attendees, we got a break. Please transition to our next set of sessions that start at 1:30, and hopefully you stay with us, and then we'll have a closeout plenary session with NWCB colleagues later in the evening, early evening. So thank you again. Thank you again, Brother Mustafa, for those great words, insightful words, and enjoy the rest of the symposium, everybody.